So good afternoon and a warm welcome to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. For those who don't know me, I'm Sabine Schmidtke, the permanent faculty at the School of Historical Studies representing Near Eastern Studies. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker of today. Khaled Fahmy is a historian of the modern Middle East with a specialty in the social and cultural history of 19th century Egypt. Born and raised in Egypt, Fahmy studied economics for his BA and then political science for his MA, both degrees he received from the American University in Cairo. He then went to the University of Oxford, where he wrote his full dissertation on the history of the Egyptian army during the first half of the 19th century. Khaled taught at Princeton University, NYU, Harvard University, and at the American University of Cairo in Cairo. And in 2017, he joined the University of Cambridge in the UK. Khaled was elected this year to a fellowship of the British Academy. And during the current academic year, he also holds the Patricia Cronin membership at the School of Historical Studies at the IAS here in Princeton. Khaled will speak for about 60 minutes. This will leave us some 30 minutes for discussion in the end. Please type your questions and comments by using the chat function or the Q&A, addressing the panelists either during or after the presentation. Now, without further ado, I pass the floor to Khaled.
Thank you very much, Sabine. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you all today. Thanks all of you for coming and attending this this lecture. My project in the Institute this year is to work on what I hope will be a revisionist history of the 1967 war from an Egyptian perspective. By revisionist history, I hope I will be able, to do something similar to what I did in my first book on Mehmed Ali's army, which is to write the history of that army from the perspective of the soldiers. Now, of course, with 1967, it is particularly difficult because of many things, including the absence of official documents of that war. I mean, it's infinitely easier to write history of the Egyptian army in the 19th century than it is to write the history of the Egyptian army in the 20th century in any of Egypt's confrontations with its main adversary, Israel. Today, I will not be talking about soldiers. I will be limiting my narrative to what I would call the frame story. That is the story of the generals and of the commanders. I'll be speaking mostly and limiting myself to the Egyptian side. And I would like to start with just pointing out the famous slogan or the famous saying, victors write history. I'll be talking about victors in this afternoon, but not the typical victors of this war. I'll hardly mention Israel at all. As I said, I will be talking and limiting myself to Egypt. Again, very little about other Arab players. And I'll do my best to lay the contours of what I consider, I hope, to be a revisionist account of the war. Just to give you an account of what I want to do, I'll start by offering a brief, hopefully brief, outline of the war for those of you who who are not familiar with it. Then I'll say something about how the war is remembered in Egypt, which can in and of itself be a subject of a study, a freestanding study. But I just want to mention a few elements there. And then I want to delve into what I hope would be a clearer, coherent, but tense alternative or revisionist narrative of the war. So let us start with a brief account of the war. Again, for those of you who are not familiar, because I know many people are attending who may not be familiar with the geography, we'll be talking mostly about Sinai and events happening in Sinai. Not even the 6 days, but the first 3 days of the war. But before doing so, again, let me just say something about a brief account of the war. Now, of course, any brief account in and of itself will be contested, and anything that I say is, I understand, contested, and that's the nature of the subject matter. But let me, for simplicity's sake, just make the argument that the war can be said to have begun with a crisis that started on the 14th of May, 1967. On that day, the Soviet Union sent to Egypt through various routes information that there was Israeli troop concentration on the northern borders, that is the borders with Syria. Given that Egypt had signed a defense pact with Syria the previous year in December of 1966, the Egyptians felt compelled to come to the assistance of their ally. Again, everything that I just said is contested. Till today, we don't know why the Soviets sent this information, because it was not true. And why the Egyptians felt compelled to do so is, as I hope will be clear, is also contested. But on the following day, the 15th of May, the commander, Abdel Hakim Amer, who is the Vice President of Egypt and the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Army, sent his Chief of Staff, Mohammed Fawzi, to Syria to investigate in person whether there is any truth to these this information about Israeli troop concentration. And before Fawzi even came back from his trip to Syria to say that he saw nothing, Amer issued a general order for mobilization. So the armed forces, the Egyptian armed forces, were put in highest alert. General mobilization was ordered, and troops were already being sent into Sinai. We see here, and the way the troops were mobilized was unprecedented. They were mobilized and paraded through the streets of Cairo under the windows of the European and foreign embassies. And we see the New York Times actually remarking on this, saying the troop movements in daylight are rare in Cairo. The Ahram, when it covered the news, made a point to say that foreign news agencies have picked up on this troops mobilization, and even commented that they indicated that this was premeditated or pre-planned. In other words, it was not just haphazard. This is what Al-Ahram is saying here. 3 days later, on the 18th of May, another step was taken, very serious, that escalated the chances of an actual confrontation when Egypt asked the United Nations emergency force that had been patrolling the borders between Sinai and Israel to withdraw. these troops had been stationed there following the previous military confrontation in 1956, specifically when Israel withdrew from Sinai in 1957. One of the conditions was to ask a newly created United Nations emergency force, actually the first United Nations peacekeeping force ever to be created, to be stationed on the Egyptian side of the borders. Now, Egypt, 10 years later, decided that they did ask the United Nations troops to withdraw. 4 days later, and on the 22nd of May, a momentous event, a decision was taken, actually announced by Nasser in a Sinai airfield. We see the picture of the announcement, basically of closing the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli navigation. Now, this is a serious escalation because Israel had always considered the closure of the Straits of Tiran or the Gulf of Aqaba to be a casus belli, to be an act of war. And in fact, when Israel withdrew back in 1957 from Sinai, it had managed to secure from the United States government a pledge that the United States would guarantee the freedom of navigation in the Gulf of Aqaba. So there's a serious escalation. And because of this pledge, immediately 4 days later, Israel sent its foreign minister, Abba Eban, to meet with President Johnson in person to tell him, A, we want you to deliver on your pledge to open the Straits of Tiran. We were not asking for military aid, but he was trying to make a point that Israel was actually facing an existential threat, to which Johnson responded by saying, look, we don't really buy this particular line. Our intelligence services are telling us that the United Arab Republic, which was the official name of Egypt at that time, if it attacks, you will whip hell out of them. These are his words in his own memoirs. Nasser, in the meantime, upped the ante, and in a big press conference 3 days later, on the 29th of May, he says, if Israel wants war, we are ready for it. He said the coming war will not just be a small war, it will be to rectify the wrong that had been inflicted all the way back in 1948, that is the creation of the State of Israel. And then he said something that was very difficult for the translators to translate. He used an Arabic word that is a word that is veering on the obscene. He said, in answer to a question by a British correspondent who told him, I've been following you, I've been following the events in this part of the world. I actually followed the previous encounter. Now we are 11 years later. You are 11 years older. Are you up to it? To which Nasser responds by saying in Arabic, أنا مش خرع زي إيدن. Which is difficult, as people laughed because it's a difficult word to translate. Basically, I'm not a wimp, like Prime Minister Eden, who had fallen because of the Suez Crisis 10 years earlier, or 11 years earlier. The word wimp, the word khira in Arabic carries the same sexual connotations that the word wimp has in English. I am the man that I was back then. I'm here to stay, he said. Things escalated further. On the 1st of June, Israel sends It's Mossad chief, Meir Amit, to Washington. This time he meets McNamara, the Secretary of State, not the president. This is an interesting visit. Obviously, the Israeli army considered Abba Eben's visit to have failed. And there is, again, lots of controversy whether the Israelis wanted a green light from the Americans. The argument is, most people say, they didn't get a green light, but they didn't get a red light, they got an amber light. 25 years later, in his memoirs, Amit said and confessed that McNamara asked him, how long do you think this coming confrontation would last? And he said, 7 days. We'll finish off the business in 7 days. And then he asked about casualties, and he said, here I became a diplomat. I said less than in 1948 when we had 600 people killed, 6,000. Immediately after he arrived back to Israel, a government of national unity was formed in which Moshe Dayan, the hero of Suez back in 1956, was appointed as Minister of Defense. This was taken by Nasser to be a war cabinet, that things are escalating further. The following day, Nasser met with his military command. We don't see him here in this picture. This is a very rare picture that I managed to find of a very important meeting on the 2nd of June. Nasser had not yet arrived to that meeting, but in that meeting, Nasser, who arrived a bit later, told his generals a couple of very important things. First, he said he gave them orders not to initiate hostilities. And he also predicted the time and the manner in which Israel will attack. He said the war is inevitable, 100%. We saw a war cabinet being sworn in Tel Aviv yesterday. They mean business. This is serious. If I were in Dayan's shoes, I will see the Arab troop concentrations, especially the Iraqis who have pledged to send troops to the war front via Jordan. I will not wait until the Iraqis arrive at my borders, which will take a couple of days. I will have to attack earlier. In other words, he said to his generals, I predict that Israel will attack most likely on the 5th of June, most likely in the morning, most likely on our air bases. On the 5th of June, in the morning, Israel attacked simultaneously 16 of Egypt's air bases, exactly as Nasser had predicted. There was some heroic resistance by pilots who tried against all odds to deal with this simultaneous attacks. But the Israelis were actually had been using a new bomb which destroyed the runways and penetrated underneath the surface of the runways. And then later, when the Egyptians thought that the raid was over, the bombs would explode. So basically the runways became inoperable. And by the end of the day, 90% of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed. At the same time, a three-pronged attack started on the 5th of June. This is the second and the third days here. And with no air cover, the fate of the Egyptian army in Sinai was doomed, and a general withdrawal order was issued. It was very badly conceived and badly executed. The withdrawal ended up being a rout, with 85% of Egyptian equipment lost or destroyed, and between 10 and 15,000 men killed, and an equal number either wounded or taken prisoner. With the southern front taken, Israel moved north to take the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and then the Golan Heights. By the end of the war, Israel had managed to inflict a devastating defeat on 3 of its enemies, and it has managed to quadruple its size. On the 9th of June, realizing the scale of the defeat, Nasser decides to resign. He goes on air and announces his resignation. And even before he finished his resignation, people took to the streets, not only in Cairo, not only in Arab cities, but throughout the Arab world, asking him to rescind his resignation. This is actually the 10th of June, but the demonstrations had started in the evening when he was delivering his speech at 7 p.m. Throughout the 10th of June, the scale of the demonstrations became enormous. He decides to rescind his resignation, sending waves of relief and actual jubilation. There's a picture in Egyptian parliament, the picture that we see here on the right. Few months later, Nasser manages to get all the Arab leaders behind him. They conduct a famous summit in Khartoum, in Sudan in August, the summit of the 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. 2 weeks later, Amir, the head of the army, commits suicide on the 13th of September. And this is the coverage of Al-Ahram of the event 3 days later. And then in October, Egypt launches what is known as the War of Attrition, basically saying, we will continue to fight. We will try everything possible to make sure that Israel is not sitting peacefully in Sinai, and to tell them that the coming confrontation is inevitable. Diplomatically, the war ends with the passing of the United Nations Resolution 242 that did not do what Nasser wanted it to do, which is to repeat what had happened in 56, that is to force Israel to withdraw its troops. Now, I realize this is too crude a summary, but I just needed to offer some account for those of you who don't know the story. But I also mention it because I want to revisit a number of the points I just stopped at. Now, this story is dramatic, but it becomes even more dramatic when we zoom in on things domestic in Egypt. But before doing so, let me again share with you briefly a couple of points of what I think how the war is remembered in Egypt. Again, this is a huge topic. As I said, it can be a subject of an independent study. But what I want to say here is that we don't have one narrative. We don't even have 2 narratives, as we see in Israel, more or less. We don't even know what to disagree about in Egypt. But let me offer you some of the points of contention, some of the things that people remember. And hopefully also it will become clear what is it that people do not remember. One of the things that we remember clearly is the blatant lies of the media. At a time when the Air Force was being destroyed, the Egyptian media, both on radio and on the press, newspapers, were actually saying that we were winning, we were about to enter Tel Aviv. So this is one thing we always kind of make fun of, but in a bittersweet way. Then, of course, Nasser's resignation, which is a subject of many studies and many films. Actually, there is a recent documentary done about the films and the TV series that depicted this very, very dramatic moment. I'll be happy to discuss this with you in the Q&A if you want. And then the demonstrations, the nature of the demonstrations, were they staged, were they spontaneous? If they're spontaneous, how come? What does it mean for people to ask the person responsible for the defeat who actually admitted the responsibility to actually stay in power? It's a very, very strange moment. And in my mind, very, very profound moment. Then there is Amer's suicide. Did he commit suicide? Or as the joke went, was he suicided? Did Nasser kill him? And then we remember the trials especially of the Air Force commanders back in, a few months later in March 1968. And we see them here, and the one on the left, who's the head of the Air Force, the commander-in-chief, got only 15 years, when people actually had been expecting capital punishment, given that this is what they've been told over the previous few months, that the Air Force and Air Force Defense were the main culprits in this war. The lenient sentences of this trial is what triggered people to take to the streets, students and workers. And this, again, especially for the left in Egypt, is fondly remembered. This is Egypt's 1968 moment. It actually is a 1968 moment. And this is how it is remembered. And finally, the war of attrition is remembered. The fact that Egypt did not surrender. The fact that Egypt was determined to live to fight another day. And the guy on the right is especially fondly remembered, Abdelmenam Riyad, who was killed in an Israeli attack in 1969 on the front. So interestingly, in many of these accounts of what I have just enumerated, I think one of the things that is missing is the actual fighting in Sinai. Maybe because it was too short, too brief, but I think maybe because the documents are not there, it's difficult to reconstruct. And of course, because it's very painful, the stories that are told are stories of defeated men who escaped and fled. But every now and then, when you poke deeper, you discover real heroic feats that were done by people who did not simply abandon their equipment and leave, people who were killed, people who resisted, and people who put up a fight. But it's not remembered, and there's very little written about this. Now, the documents are there. There are copious documentation within the Egyptian army. There are many fact-finding commissions that were established. There's a parliamentary fact-finding commission established in 1977. The records of many of the trials, it's not only the Air Force commanders, but as I would say, other trials and other courts martial that were established in the weeks, months, and years following the defeat. All of this is sealed. There are the cabinet meetings, the presidency's meetings, and the army itself, the operations, the logbooks of units. Armies are huge bureaucratic enterprises, and they generate an enormous amount of books, books, but also paper. All of this is sealed. It's very difficult, not only for historians, but even for army generals to have access to the archives of the Egyptian armed forces, which is in Abbasiyya, in Cairo. Okay, so this is the background to my project. This is, I shared with you something about the a brief account of the war, and something about how it is remembered. Now I want to take you into what it is that I am attempting to do. What kind of revisionist narrative that is possible. Again, I'm still at the very beginning. This is what I'm spending my year doing in the Institute. Sadly, I'm not there in Princeton. I'm still here in Cambridge. Hopefully, I'll manage when things improve to go there in person. I start with the obvious question. How can we explain, this is a small question, a tactical question. How can we explain these serious steps that escalated things leading up to the outbreak of war? Why is this an important question? It's important because the Egyptian army was not ready. The Egyptian army was busy fighting elsewhere. The Egyptian army had been 70,000 troops were already stationed in Yemen, thousands of miles away, fighting another war against colonial remnants and imperial designs by Britain, United States, and Israel in the south of Arabia. This had started in 1962, and what was expected to be only a short operation ended up being Nasser's Vietnam. 70,000 troops bogged down there. But also, not only given this, but given the very unprepared situation of the army. Now, we know this from various sources. In 1988, this man gave a very important interview in one of the Egyptian weekly newspapers, weekly magazines. Anwar al-Qadi is the commander of the Egyptian forces in Yemen from October 62 to November 63. But more importantly, for our purposes, he was director of operations in 1966 to 67. So he was like the fourth man in the chain of command. He's beneath the commander-in-chief, who is in turn beneath the supreme commander, the deputy supreme commander, who's Amir, who's beneath Nasser. The operations basically translate the general directives of the command, the joint chiefs of staff's orders to the field commanders in Sinai. This guy says in 1988 that way back in 1966, they wrote a report warning against any escalation. And they forwarded the report to Amir, telling him the army is not ready for any confrontation with Israel, that it would not be ready for another 3 years at least, that the army is suffering from serious underfunding, that the budget had been seriously curtailed, that as a result, the men are not trained, that the equipment does not have spare parts or even updated, that the first and second lines of defense in Sinai are not ready, that there is no coordination, no maneuvers that the army had been exercising to coordinate the army, the navy, and the air force. And that Yemen is a gulping up and eating up all the resources. The question is, did Nasser know this? That's a big question that we have. Now, this is an important question again, because Nasser, back in 1965, in a famous speech, had said, the war is inevitable, another confrontation with Israel is inevitable, but we should be the ones who decide the time and place of battle. We will not allow the enemy to dictate the time and place of battle on us. So the time and the place is known, but the timing is wrong. So the question is, how do we explain this? How do we explain the escalation, given the fact that the army is dismally ill-prepared for yet another war? Now, there are various explanations that have been offered left and right over the past 50 plus years to this intriguing question. One of the most famous is by Haeckel, who's a very important person. He's not only Nasser's speechwriter, he's not only the editor-in-chief of the government newspaper Al-Ahram. He's the ideologue of the regime. He's Nasser's confidant. He is his mind. He's a policymaker. He has a position unique among journalists. There's no journalist anywhere in the world who occupied a position like that Haeckel occupied. Anyway, Haeckel wrote many books, including a four-volume huge book. This is like 1,000 pages long. Already a third volume of what he called the 30-Year War. And in that war, in that book, he basically says that this is a big, grand conspiracy of oil magnates, of arms dealers and intelligence officers dragging Nasser into Yemen and from Yemen into a confrontation with Israel. And that is how he explains this big drama. A much slimmer book by Malcolm Kerr makes the argument that Nasser basically was engaged in a bitter war with his Arab rivals. And again, there are many explanations. Some of them are grand, some are zoom in on this or that particular event that I'll spare you, but again, I'll be happy to share some of this with you in the Q&A. I personally think that the best angle through which to view this war is what everybody in Egypt at that time knew, and what everybody has been commenting on since then, which is a rivalry between Nasser and Amir. But not only a rivalry between these two men, but a rivalry between these two important institutions, the presidency and the army. The best person who lays out this argument is my colleague here in Cambridge, Hazem Kandil, in a couple of books, but this is the relevant one, Soldiers, Spies, and Statesmen. He basically says it's not only a rivalry between two institutions, but between three. It's a triangle of power, as is depicted in the title of the book. Soldiers is the army, spies is the intelligence services, and statesmen is basically the presidency. How does Kandil and others flesh out this rivalry, this grand drama. Basically, it starts all the way back when the friendship of these two men started. These are very, very close buddies. They've gone to the military academy together, they graduated together, they served together. Most importantly, they staged the coup in 1952 that brought them to power together. But the story then gets more complicated because the question immediately after the coup was, how do we make sure that the army does not stage yet another coup? How do we coup-proof the army? The answer that Nasser gave to his colleagues is to give the army to his best friend and trusted friend, Aimer. Little did he know that Aimer eventually would build an empire out of his own, using the army as his base and preventing Nasser year after year from encroaching into the army. This tension between them, and it's a weird tension because they actually love each other. Nasser's son is named after Aimer, Aimer's son is named after Nasser, Nasser's brother is married to Aimer's daughter, and so on and so forth. But they also are very jealous of each other. And eventually in 1962, Aimer threatens Nasser with a veiled coup against him, the result of which Nasser loses all command over the army, most importantly, the ability to appoint senior commanders. And again, the interesting thing is that it's not only these two men, but it is the institutions that they represent. Now, let us zoom in, let us use this viewpoint as a starting point, as a lens through which to revisit the army, the war. So all the events that I summarized earlier on, let us now revisit them to see how they are infinitely more complex, more dramatic, actually more tragic than they initially appeared. Let's start with the mobilization order, way back on the 15th of May. We now know that this decision was taken by Aimer, not by Nasser. As I said earlier, Aimer did not even wait for the commander-in-chief to return from the trip to Syria with news refuting the Soviet information. Even before he returned, Aimer mobilized without taking the authorization from Nasser. The second stage is the second step, the expulsion of the United Nations troops. Nasser wanted to redeploy them rather than to withdraw them altogether. But Aimer had already sent a letter to the commander of the United Nations troops in Sinai, saying complete withdrawal and rather than redeployment. And when Nasser attempted to rectify this, Aimer told him the letter had already been dispatched. It's too late to take it back. Most dramatically, this very important decision. This was announced on the 22nd of May, but the decision was taken in Nasser's own home 2 days earlier. We know this from various other books that I can share with you later, that recount a very dramatic confrontation in which Nasser was against the closure. And it was Aimer who said, look, we expelled the troops, the United Nations troops, we're sending our men. What guarantees do I have when I send my men in Sharm el-Sheikh and they see Israeli ships going up and down the strait in front of them what guarantees do I have that they will not decide to shoot at them? They cannot control their nerves. Basically, he's telling him, are you a man? My men are ready for fight. And that is when they have first they had a vote, and then they have another vote. It's a group of old buddies, not even the cabinet, they're not ministers, they're the old friends, and Nasser loses, and Amer wins. And 2 days later, we see Amer here. This is a very tense situation for Nasser. Nasser doesn't know his men, doesn't know his officers. He has a very tense relationship with them. These are all Amer's colleagues. Actually, they are his boys, as he called them. These are the pilots. And Nasser, in that meeting, told them, we will not be the first to strike. They were very dismayed. When he left the room, Amer returns back to them and says, don't worry, boys, we will fight. ما تخافوش يا أولاد, هنحارب. Then another dramatic event happens a couple of days later. So this 22nd of May, there is a plan that Israel, when Israel invaded Sinai, they found this document and they immediately released it to say, you see, we were right. They were actually planning to attack us. And what we did was a preemptive strike. This is a battle plan for an air strike called Dawn, Fajr, that was supposed to be launched on the 27th of May. This document is dated 26th of May for the day following an attack on Eilat in the south of Israel, an air attack on Eilat. We have an account, a fascinating account by this guy in this book. Now, this is a fascinating scholar, historian, controversial figure. We can again talk about him. He has another very important book that he wrote. But this is a novel, but it's a novel that is most likely based on true events. And one of the events that are depicted in this novel is that of that airstrike and how it was aborted. He says that the pilots, he's telling the story of one particular pilot who was summoned from his home and rushed to Sinai to meet in an airbase with other pilots, only to receive, supposedly, this battle plan. Directives are coming from an officer from Cairo. They meet the pilots, they gather together to receive their battle orders, only to discover that the battle orders are based on very faulty intelligence. There's a map, there's a picture, an aerial picture of Eilat that is that big, that the officer, the intelligence officer sent from Cairo is delivering to them. They look at this picture and they say, well, what is this supposed to mean? How can we know that this is, what is this? When was this picture taken, they ask. And they were told it was taken in 1948. This gives you an idea of the faulty intelligence that this army was depending on. Now we know that military intelligence was actually busy spying on Egyptian officers, whether or not they are pro-Nasser or pro-Amer. And we discover this in a recent book that, again, I'll be happy to share with you. But back to the Dawn plan. Now, it's interesting. Let me take you through a couple of incidences about this. Let us go back, this 27th of May. Remember the previous day, Abba Eban is meeting with Johnson in the White House, telling him we're facing existential threat. Johnson tells him, we don't believe you. But in the middle of that meeting, Eben receives a phone call from his embassy in Washington, telling him that they received intelligence from Egypt. Maybe a spy. Still, I don't know where the source of this intelligence, that Egypt is planning an attack tomorrow. So they knew about this planned attack. When the meeting was over, Johnson immediately calls the Soviet premier Kosygin, who then calls his ambassador in Egypt, who goes to Nasser at 3 a.m. in the morning, wakes him up, and Nasser tells him, I don't know about this. And then 2 hours later, in the morning of that day, Nasser summons Amir to tell him, what are you planning? And he tells him, I'm planning an attack. He tells him, you don't have an authorization. We didn't discuss this. And that is how the plan was aborted. So what we are talking about here is a serious rift between, now there are always tensions between military and civilian, and the politicians and the military. Israel had the same thing, but never to that degree. And then we come to this conference, the press conference in which he said, I'm not a wimp. I think he was actually telling Amir this. He wasn't telling the British journalist. He was telling Amir and his men and his officers and his commanders in the army, I am not a wimp. And Mishkhira is not intended for Eden or international public opinion, but to his own army. And then we come to this, again, very tense meeting in which it became clear that the army is feeling it is not being taken seriously and ordered not to launch the opening salvos. And that is what continues to be a grudge that many people in the army till today feel against Nasser. He's the one responsible because of his meddling in military affairs. The fact of the matter is that the army was actually even ill-prepared for even a defensive act. In that meeting, Nasser tells his army commanders, and especially Air Force commanders, withdraw your fighters from Sinai to the mainland. The problem is that the airfields in the mainland are not prepared to receive all of these aircraft. So it became clear in that meeting that the army is doomed already, even before fighting started. And just to illustrate this further, just to see how even the command and control structure of the army is actually divided. This is how it is supposed to function. Nasser, beneath him Amir, beneath him Fawzi, that is the commander, the chief of general staff. But in fact, so Fawzi is Nasser's man, but Amir cannot stand him. So Amir circumvents him and is another parallel chain of command to the army and the navy and the air forces. And Nasser basically cannot reach. And the result is, as we know from the memoirs of the commanders in Sinai, is that we don't know who we're receiving orders from. Not only this, they say, we don't even know whether our plans are defensive or offensive. That deep. It's not like what the target tomorrow tactically will be. We just don't know the general purpose of our presence in Sinai? Are we supposed to launch an attack? Are we supposed, these are generals, big generals, and they write repeatedly, all of them, in the memoirs published years later, that this is the situation. So it's an army that is defeated even before outbreak of war. It's lacking funds, it's lacking training, it's lacking equipment, it's lacking intelligence, and even a unified command. The question then, did it have to take the defeat? So basically my point is that the army, the defeat is inevitable. The question is whether the defeat had to take the form it did. Now, I will postpone answering this question until I take you to one last episode or a group of episodes that is the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of the war. And that is how I would like to end. So a couple of more minutes and I will be done. So let's see how the war actually ended. Now, actually, on the 8th of June, these two men meet for the first time since the 5th of June. They meet again on the 8th of June in military command in Cairo. Nasser goes there. This is not his terrain. He's not comfortable going there. He goes there. Now everything has become clear. It's utter defeat. They both agree together that they will announce their resignation the following day. Now, as we know, Nasser actually announces his resignation. People take to the streets. He rescinds his resignation. Aimer goes to him and he says, okay, now I want to come back again, like you. He tells him, yeah, but the people want me. They don't want you. And to cut it short, the Ahram announces the resignation of Aimer in the most humiliating way. Page 4, in a small item of news. Yeah. So this is, all of Egypt went out yesterday asking Nasser to stay in power. And here, Field Marshal Aimer decided to give up all his posts effective 6:30 p.m. last night. The following day, 11th of June, is the most dramatic day as far as Egypt is concerned, as far as Nasser is concerned. Because on that day, 4 of the leading generals in the army storm into Nasser's office and asks, kind of commands him to reinstate Aimer. Nasser dismisses them. He announces huge changes. He actually removes Aimer officially and appoints Fawzi, his picture is here, in his place. And these 4 are not simply, 4 generals, are not simply pensioned, they're cashiered. And I want to talk about one of them in particular. The plot thickens because now all of the defeated generals congregate to Aimer's home in Giza, and they start hatching a plot to get rid of Nasser. And they meet throughout June, July, August, and finally, Nasser's intelligence men decide this is very dangerous. This guy in particular sees that there's no way that this can continue. And it's not only these 2 men, the country is divided into 2 halves. And these are senior members of the cabinet, senior members of intelligence service, senior members of the army, plotting against each other. And finally, Egypt's Beria, Nasser's chief intelligence man, lures Amir to Nasser's home, puts him, arrests him, deprives him of his bodyguards, puts him in a house arrest, eventually sends him to a place outside Cairo where he commits suicide. I mean, this is like 3 weeks later. It's a huge, now the question is whether it was a suicide or suicided, as I said earlier, is not known. Then a few months later, all the ringleaders are put on trial and given long prison sentences. There is an interesting episode that I wanted to concentrate on, but I think I'm running out of time, and this episode will require some time. So maybe we will leave it for the Q&A. Let me just sum up with maybe a sentence or two by saying that this is not simply a fight between two men. It's a fight between two institutions, the army and the military. This fight is symptomatic of a dysfunctional political system that is predicated upon disenfranchising the Egyptian people. There's no oversight of the press, there's no oversight of parliament, there's no oversight even of Nasser over his military. It is a corrupt regime to the marrow. So the country, in addition, the country is facing regional and international rivalry and a very formidable enemy that was well prepared, armed to its teeth, and seizing the opportune moment to jump on its adversary. So while Israel's military, economic, diplomatic superiority made the defeat of the Egyptian army inevitable, the way the defeat took shape, the particular way in which the Egyptian army was defeated, owes a lot to domestic factors and specifically to the rivalry between these two men. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khaled, for this very interesting presentation. We already received many questions, and we will try to address as many queries as possible over the next 30 minutes, but please bear with us if this will not be possible. Other than that, as you already do, please use both the chat and the Q&A. Please don't raise your hands. We have too many participants, so I can't allow anyone to speak, because this is the only way we can do right now. Okay, so let me jump right into the question, Khaled, if I may. Let's maybe group them together. So 2 questions I have here from 2 different attendees. First of all, how do you think Nasser could predict precisely the Israeli attack? And the second one about Amir, did Amir actually believe that the army was ready, or was his calculation entirely political, that is to undermine Nasser?
Thank you. 2 very good questions. As I said, Nasser said it's a matter of timing. The Iraqi troops are amassing on the border with Jordan. They will take 2 days until they arrive at the Jordanian-Israeli borders, And he said, if I were an Israeli commander and I have this information, I will not wait until this happens. I will launch my preemptive strike now. Now, how will they launch the strike? He said, because they asked him, and people who wrote the memoirs of this, the account of this encounter, this dramatic encounter on the 2nd of June, they recount the story that they asked him this question, and he responded by saying, it's not because of any military intelligence I have, it's just thinking logically. And that is how Nasser was a very clever strategist, looking in the global picture, looking in the map of the world at large, doesn't have military intelligence. Military intelligence is controlled by his adversary. But they didn't believe him. They didn't take him seriously. Which brings me to the second question. What did really Amer believe? Well, Amer, in one of these many meetings, is reported to have said, I have a vendetta with Diane from 1956, and I want to cleanse it. I think, so this is one aspect. I think he also had a vendetta with Nasser, because Nasser came out victorious in 1956. The army was defeated in 1956, but Nasser won a diplomatic victory. And as far as the relationship between these two institutions and men are concerned, that is 1 point for Nasser and 0 points for Amer. So he wanted to get this out of the way. I think the best explanation, so these are small things, but I think Amer's decision is built on two things. One, a complete underestimation of Israel's strength, completely dismissing it. He has no intelligence, he's not a strategist, he doesn't know, he thinks it will be not defeated. He doesn't think he can defeat Israel, but he didn't think he would be defeated that way. And I think his calculation was, I'll provoke a skirmish on the borders, and that would stir things up. And either I win this military skirmish and I score a point against both Israel and Nasser, or I lose. In this case, I will not be defeated, but in this case, I'll ask the United States to step in. I think that Amer represents a tendency within the Nasser regime that ultimately got personified in Sadat. That is, Nasser is a maverick politician. He's opening up so much that we cannot control. This is not our fight. We should not be fighting for the Palestinians. It's the United States that controls the keys. We go to the United States, ask them to mediate, and we give in. This is what Sadat did a few years later. But that mentality is embedded in the army. There is a tendency within the regime and in the army, represented by Amer, to do so in the name of realism. So let's be realistic. We will fight, but we cannot defeat Israel. So let's reach a settlement. And I think this is what he was aiming to do. This is to give him the benefit of the doubt. To err on the other side is that he's a completely reckless, irresponsible, thoroughly corrupt, inept general. And everything about his biography supports the second explanation. But just to give him the benefit of the doubt, I think he thought he could get away with this small fight on the borders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Again, I'm grouping together two questions. One question is, what is the explanation behind the lack of US-Soviet interference to de-escalate the conflict as they did in '56? And actually the Soviets acted even in the other direction. And the other question relates to what you said before. What aspects of Kandil's story of rivalry between domestic branches most needs to be elaborated or supplemented?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question again?
What the book of Kandil that you mentioned between the three factors that were rivals of each other, the domestic branches. to what extent do you think that Kandil's analysis needs to be elaborated or supplemented? And do you have any specific areas of disagreement with his account of the story?
Thank you. Look, the Soviets, the Soviet position is a complex one. The Soviets did not egg them on, did not egg the Egyptians on. They tried to say, we are behind you, but we do not really need this confrontation, and we do not need a confrontation with the United States. As far as the Egyptian side is concerned, I'm concerned with the Egyptian side. There's a lot of stories about what is it exactly that the Egyptians understood the Soviets to be saying. There's a lot that was lost in translation in many senses of the word, of this phrase. The most serious mistranslation, misunderstanding is that happened in the visit of the Egyptian Minister of War himself, Shams Badran, 2 days before the war. He goes to Moscow and reports back and gives Amir a report that is very different from what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had given. So the meeting between the Egyptian military commanders and the Soviet military commanders in Moscow in preparation for the war is completely misinterpreted by the military, Shams Badran, Amir's man, and the diplomats, the Egyptian diplomats who are attending that meeting, forwarding their reports to Nasser. So there's a lot of studies about this. And really, this is my project. I am not interested in the Soviet position as such. I'm interested in how the Soviet position was understood in Egypt. Now, my position with Kandil, I buy his argument, the overall argument. I think Kandil is not a historian, which doesn't mean anything. Kandil did a wonderful job in presenting a very, very convincing narrative in this particular chapter of his book. He starts the story in 52 and ends in 2011. But the chapter on 67 in particular is very gripping. And what he did is basically says, look, you don't need even to go to the archives, just read the literature, read what is published already. And he weaves together a compelling story. Where I would like to not disagree with him, build on his work, is to translate this tension between these two men to tensions on the ground in Sinai. And I would like to seize this opportunity to take you to the thing that I have cut out, which has to do with exactly this. And it has to do with this man. Now, his name is Othman Nassar. He's a general, he's a commander of a division. A division in the Egyptian army is about 11,000 men. So it's a huge, small army in the middle of Sinai. He's put on trial here because of his not participation in the war and his bad participation, but because of his attempt at, his participation in the coup attempt. In the middle of this trial, military intelligence then sends information to the tribunal here. This is not a military tribunal, this is a civilian one, saying that this guy, in addition to committing this big crime of plotting against Nasser, he was one of the 4 generals who stormed into his office on the 11th of June. Back in the war itself, specifically on the 6th of June, he deserted his men in the middle of battle. And when he was caught by the commander-in-chief of the front, telling him, what are you doing here? Why are you deserting your men? He told them, I heard there's a meeting in Cairo, so I'm going to attend it. He said, no, there's no meeting in Cairo. There's a war in Sinai. Go back to your men. And this scandal became so famous, the press covered it to the degree that there's even a cartoon about it, that he deserted his men. Now, I have recently acquired the memoirs of this guy. And I now have his answer back. And his answer back to these allegations, it's a memoir written in prison about the accusations leveled against him, not in this tribunal, but in the actual military trial that is secret, that we still don't know the details. They accuse him of failing to launch a counterattack to take El Arish in the north of Sinai. They accuse him and they accuse him of desertion. To which he responds by saying, look, I was given inadequate equipment and weapons, specifically no equipment for night vision. And we have to attack at night because in the morning, Israel commands the skies. So you have not provided me with proper equipment. Then he says the signal corps is not working, is not telling me which route to take. Most seriously, he's saying the intelligence officer in El Arish, because it's military intelligence, is busy spying on us rather than telling me exact information about the enemy. And lastly, he says, I did not desert my men. It's because of lack of communication. Communication lines were broken. I went to the general front command in person only to find them packing and leaving. This is the kind of detail that is missing in Qandil's book. It's how the rivalry between these two men led to a breakdown of the army in the middle of combat. This is an army that is completely dysfunctional. It's not 10,000, it's 100,000 men. This is what Israel wants to portray constantly. But Israel knew, as they said to Washington, that we can finish it off in 1 week. Why? Because it is a defeated army, as we see. So this is the kind of link that between the rivalry that Qandil paints a very good picture of in Cairo and the events in Sinai that is missing from his book. And that is precisely what I am doing, and also adding the personal stories of the men, of the soldiers, and not the big commanders, but the soldiers who fought heroically and who paid a very, very deep, heavy price.
Thank you. I'm summarizing two questions that concern Anwar Sadat. One question is, what was Sadat's role in the internal fights between Nasser and Amir? And the second one is in 1977, Sadat walks into the path of peace, a peace which holds till this day. Why didn't Nasser foresee this road of history and initiate it himself?
Sadat was the Speaker of Parliament, and he and Amir were one of the very few people left from the initial Revolutionary Command Council, the so-called three officers who staged the coup in 1952. Way back, 15 years later, in 1967, very few of this original group of men remain. Amir is one, he has the army. And Sadat is one of the two other people who remain, and he is keeping a low profile. In that rivalry, Sadat would not take clear signs. And no one trusted him. And he was dubbed as a dancer, Ra'as, juggler. who is unprincipled, doesn't have a clear sign. This is how they write about him, these men, in their memoirs. And in that very important confrontation on the 25th of August, 1967, when Amir is summoned to Nasser's men and confronted and told, we know what you're doing. You're staging a coup with your officers, with your men. He denies, he tries to commit suicide. This is the first of 4 attempts. He tries to commit suicide. Then Sadat tells him, confronts him. He tells him, Ya Abd al-Hakim, احنا عارفين انت بتعمل ايه. We know what you're up to. So Amir responds to him, you, and he used some obscene words referring to his mother's skin color, and tells him, Ya Ra'as, you juggler. You telling me I am much more senior, and so on and so forth. So this is how this is the position of Sadat. Sadat at that time is keeping a low key. He's not a main player. No one took him seriously. No one trusted him. 1977 depends on how you want to see it. This is beyond the lecture, the subject of this lecture. But of course, I will end the book with an account of what happened in 73, which is again something that Kandil touches upon. That tense relationship between the president and the officers and the army continues in 73. And there is a credible line to be said that what happened in 73 is that Sadat, to put it bluntly, to put it forcefully, betrayed his generals. To put it mildly, he was not completely forthcoming with them about his war intentions, that he always wanted to opt for some kind of peace settlement when his generals were preparing for something else. So there's an ongoing dialogue, and my purpose is to open this up in Egypt and to generate a healthy debate about how to pursue these questions, painful, difficult, very hard questions. But it's about time that we raise them. But the question is how to raise them in a documented, scholarly, sober, detailed manner. Because right now we have fights, we have a cacophony of attacks and counterattacks and ad hominem attacks, and I think we deserve better. We deserve a much more sober, critical, and account that takes us into all the painful questions about what happened in 67, what happened in 73, what happened in 77.
Thank you. One question goes back to the role of the Soviets. Regarding the Soviet message to Nasser on May 14, 2 Israeli researchers believe that the Soviets wanted to stimulate war so as to bring about the destruction of the nascent Israeli nuclear program. What do you think the clearly false Soviet message, why do you think the clearly false message, Soviet message was sent? And the research that is being mentioned is Fox Bats over Dimona by Isabelle Guinot and Gideon Remes. And their sources include material from declassified Soviet archives.
All the reviews of this book have trashed it. It's not credible. They are based, I mean, their sources are selective, and in scholarly communities, the book has not gained much traction. There is even an account in Oren's book. I thought I have it here, but no, here. which is the most pro-Israeli account of the war, that the most right-wing account of right-wing Israeli account of the war, that says that there might have actually been Israeli troop concentration, not to invade Syria or to bring down the regime, but to cause some disturbances. That might have been the message that was sent by the Soviets to the Egyptians. I myself have no access to either the Soviets or the Egyptian papers. The Egyptian papers are sealed. I don't speak Russian. So I don't know, but I know that a lot was misinterpreted by the Egyptians, and that there was an interest on the part of Amir to buy the argument, the message that was sent to Egypt via the Soviets. So that is the part that I'm concentrating on. How was this received, and why was it received the way it was?
Thank you. Two, again, related questions. One, do you think that Nasser abused the army's defeat to reclaim his authority politically and militarily, and to finally act as the de facto commander-in-chief instead of Amir, especially after the huge stamp of confidence that the people gave him when they asked him to rescind his resignation? And somehow related, another question, in 1962, the debacle over Amir's command in Syria would have weakened him vis-a-vis Nasser. How could he have turned the situation around to push Nasser to capitulate further in the control of the military? Also, I have seen a Time magazine article from around 62 where Amir alleges Nasser to be a dictator. How could we interpret this in light of the ideologue and 52 revolution coup, and how Egypt emerged and developed in the years following the coup? Is this institutional rivalry, or is there something deeper?
Now, the challenge in dealing with these things for me is that is to avoid taking sides between Nasser and Amir. For me, these two men, in their different ways, are responsible for what happened. And as an Egyptian 50 plus years later, I seek to know what really happened. I don't take sides. They are both, for me, they have a lot to answer for. And then the political system as such. Let me try and answer the first question. Nasser, of course, took the 9th and 10th of June events as a new authorization, as a very serious, and he was stunned by it. And it is, and he used it. This is how he used it against Amir. Now, interestingly, and this connects to the other question about 62, he knew that. He knew that in his confrontation with Amir, he has to rely on the streets. Back in 1962, at the height of this confrontation, let me answer the question about the Syria debacle. Amir returns from Syria defeated. The union with Syria breaks because of a coup that was staged from within his own office in Syria. He's not attending to his business. He's busy doing other things, and he's defeated. He comes back to Egypt, and Nasser confronts him. Nasser thinks it's time to elbow him out, only to find that Amir has his generals who basically rally behind him and tell Nasser, if you depose Amir, we will stage a coup. It was called in the literature the white coup. This is how Nasser backs down. Interestingly, in the debate between this cabal of men, Zakaria Muhyiddin, the Beria of Egypt, the founder of Egypt's intelligence services, when they think how, that is Nasser sitting with his men, how do we deal with Amir and his army? So after many suggestions, Zakaria Muhyiddin, the founder of these intelligence services, who became prime minister later on, tells Nasser, you have a speech to deliver in a few weeks' time. In that speech, you should say effectively that I cannot govern because my partner is not playing, and you announce your resignation. So of course people got stunned. They said, what do you mean? He says, well, let's use this card because we know what will happen if you resign, if you announce your resignation. The people will take to the streets, rally behind you, and now we will see what Amir will do. Will he deploy the army against the people? He won't. So this idea of using the streets, the masses, as a pawn in the internecine struggle between these different factions had been thought 5 years earlier. What happened, the difference between 62 and 67 is the army is defeated in Israel, in Sinai. So when the people take to the streets, Nasser then thinks this is his moment, and he crushes Amir and his men. But the interesting thing is that he does not lift the phone to call Dayan to tell him, I give in. Instead, he rebuilds the armed forces. And to see the effort of rebuilding the armed forces, which is not only tanks and weapons and aircraft, is to build the armed forces, the mentality, the fighting spirit, the self-dignity, and to say to this army, I will get rid of your commanders, but I want you to fight again. And this he managed to do, which again is a story that has not been told, and I think it's worth telling. Did Amir believe in democracy? I don't think so. I think he was using this card as a card against Nasser. At the end of the day, he might have been more infatuated with Western-style democracies than Nasser was. But I think Nasser understood, I think Nasser had a very, very strong, intimate familiarity with the British parliamentary system than Amir understood the French or the American ones. And I think both of them, at the end of the day, did not trust the people and did not really allow the people to have a real say in how to govern their own country.
Thank you very much. We still have a very long list of open questions, but we need to come to an end. There are many questions also about the sources you are using and what is available. So this is something that will of course be eventually in the book when you will publish it. So thank you again for being here today, and please look forward to more events coming up in the areas of Near Eastern Studies at the IIS over the course of the academic year. And of course, at least virtually, Khaled is with us, and you can also reach him. I mean, his contact details are on his website, but you can also reach him through the IIS in case you want to continue some of the discussions with him. So goodbye, and I hope that you will join us soon again for the next one.
Just also say thank you so much to you, Sabine, and thanks for everybody who attended.
Thank you. Thank you, Khaled. And thank you to everyone. Goodbye.